So I was very hopeful that the next lecture, the last one, will be with Darія Sинgaєвська, who has written this book about oligarchs and all of that kind of stuff. But unfortunately, she's sick and is not, and said that she would be quite prepared to do it online. I have subsequently tried to contact her by phone several times with no luck. So it is entirely possible that she's not going to be here. So what I propose to do in the last lecture is I'm not going to do any of these kinds of notes. I'll talk about some of the big issues facing Ukraine, and especially my experience since I came here before independence. I saw how it developed and was very involved in institutions, and very involved in economic reform, monetary reform, and this kind of stuff. And what were the challenges? And why things did not work out the way they should have. What were the basic problems? What are the lessons that we can use from other countries? I think you'll find it interesting, because these are things that a lot of people don't talk about. And it also explains what the social formation in Ukraine emerged. So let me now go through Ukrainian society on the eve of independence. And I think one of the reasons why it's important to pay attention to this period, and especially to the rise of autonomous currents within the party, and the stirring of dissent and all of that, and the crackdown and the period of stagnation under Brezhnev that engendered the collapse of the USSR. The people who participated in these processes were the ones who were very important in the establishment of the Ukrainian state. So in their mental map, they were very much aware of what had happened before, either with the dissent or what happened in the economy and this kind of stuff. And if they had an inoculation into remaining in the USSR, it's because they learned a hard lesson in the 70s and the subsequent years. Maybe they didn't learn less enough, but it's certainly people knew about that. I know because I had very many discussions with them. So I'm going to I'll focus on the social structure, the problems, and also on Petro Shelitz, the first secretary of the Communist Party, who held office between 1965 and 1972. And in general, this period, amongst like so many other periods, remains unstudied and really could use very, very good research, because it's quite fascinating, at least I think it is. So Ukraine's population growth, as we talked about, was largely because of the in-migration of Russians. And part of that growth had to do with the assimilation of Ukrainians. So the percent of Ukrainians who considered Russian as their mother tongue increased from 20% in 1959 to 27% in 1989. And if you look at the statistics, I'll give it to you a bit later, of what proportion of books came out in Ukrainian, you will understand how many of the intelligentsia were in a complete panic, because they thought Ukrainians are on the way to extinction. 10 more years of this kind of stuff, and it's like game over. The percent, so the result was that of the total population that in Ukraine, of the total population that's considered Ukrainian as their mother tongue, over a period between 59 and 89, right? It dropped from 73% to 65%, and the proportion of the population that considered Russian as their mother tongue was growing, and by 1989 was 1/3 of the population, over a third of the population. Well, during the 1960s, because of the the Khrushchev thaw, there was a significant unrest in the Republic in the 1960s, and it was often reported as an attempt to preserve Ukrainian language against Russian inroads. Thus, Ukrainians, as a method of asserting their identity, campaigned for national survival in terms of the right to speak Ukrainian. So this aspect is elucidated the most in academic literature. When people talk about the 60s, they talk about the шести, the writers and poets who were the people of the 60s. But there was a society, and they are a product of what was going on in the society, and that's very rarely mentioned. The language question is, of course, critical for a nation in its struggle for continued viability. But the language issue also played the role of a symbol in an important conflict between competing social groups, in particular Indians. The societal backdrop for the development was the urbanization, education, and social mobility of Ukrainians that was taking place. This not only led to a change in the statistical structure of the population, but also to the very nature of the population. When most Ukrainians lived in the countryside, they were very different types of Ukrainians than those who lived in cities. Because of greater mobilization, the urban, the educated, the mobile groups experienced a sharpening of ethnic awareness that arises from the possibility of constantly comparing one's own culture with other ethnic cultures in the urban community. And such an increase in ethnic awareness tends to stimulate competition between ethnic groups in a particular city. So when people in the past, because Ukrainians were such a minority in the urban population, if you're only 17% in Kiev in 1917 and you come to the city, you tend to get assimilated, unless, of course, you don't become assimilated. But the cities were great centers of assimilation. But given the fact that so many people came into the city at that time, it was no longer necessarily a factor of assimilation, but it was certainly a factor of social contestation. And the question of competition that occurred in the city was critical in explaining the rise of national consciousness. With mobilized individuals, expectations race ahead of the real possibility. These were the same people who had to compete with Russians for employment, and the rivalry led to an exacerbation of ethnic tensions. There's quite a lot of studies published in the Soviet Union, so not on the pages of Prava, but you have to look at various journals and all that, because it's such a big phenomena that it was noticed. You have to just go through an awful lot of literature to see. But for example, Kulichenko in 1972 referred to this development when he wrote, "In the present time, we are witnessing an activization of national life, a growth of national consciousness and national feeling." This is writing in 1972. Arutunyan, who did really very interesting work on these questions, he was a sociologist at Novosibirsk, and in Novosibirsk they had a school. Novosibirsk, had the advantage of being in Novosibirsk and not in Moscow. And so that academic Gorodok there was always much freer than anywhere else. The worst they could do is to send me to Siberia. Well, these guys already were there. And they developed sociology school. And some of the most interesting studies in sociology was actually came out of Novosibirsk. So he related this growth of national consciousness directly to conditions for mobility of non-Russian personnel. If there's no mobility, you're going to have national consciousness. Forget about what language you speak. As will be clear from our discussion of occupations, the conditions of mobility of Ukrainians took a turn for the worse in the 1960s, and a very significant one. And this exacerbated social tensions that resulted from the situation, and it tended to flow along national lines. So all the writers who dissect and all of that, they're in this environment where there's actually a fair amount of tensions which they express in their own way. So one of the things, I want to give you some sense of the debate and activity around the Ukrainian language that surfaced in many, many forms in the 1960s. I mean, the highest demand that could be made as regards the language was to make Ukrainian the official language of the state, a status it never should, never had, and to make and demand that it be the state language of government and administration. This was raised at a conference on the Ukrainian language held in Kyiv in February 1963, which was attended by well over 1,000 members of the intelligentsia. I mean, that's a lot of people packed into a very big hall making these demands. The conference also passed a resolution asking the Ukrainian government to not proclaim Ukrainian as the official language, but also in all workplaces. Although the party leadership did not endorse this, didn't say, yes, we agree, but there were many references made in the 1960s that it actually supported this, except they couldn't say this openly because they would get absolutely purged from Moscow. I mean, one of the institutions that was never under Union control was the KGB. It's unfortunately not mentioned when we're talking about the division in any organigram and things like this, but and most of them were always non-Ukrainians. And this was ultimately something very, very important. Getting control of the KGB was something that took some time for the Ukrainians to do.
I'm sorry, may I interrupt? I want to change the angle of the camera. 1 minute interruption. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Сісти наряд вперед.
Okay.
Almost there. Yeah.
So, I mean, in 1967, for example, in an interview, Shellis says that the Ukrainian language has been richly, immeasurably enriched since the October Revolution. Its role in social role has increased. The Ukrainian language, what's interesting about the interview, it doesn't say the Ukrainian language. He says Ukraine's language. And this whole interview is repeated about Ukraine's language. Meaning, and this one just came after all of the demands that it become a state language. He, by sort of implication, really means that this is the state language. He also told the visiting delegation in '67 that only a fool will imagine that there is any possibility of Russian taking over in Ukraine. His sentiments were echoed by the head of Gosplan, who said, I believe that in Ukraine we should speak Ukrainian. Then, during his tenure of office, he helped create a climate where demands concerning the language could be raised with greater frequency. What?
I'm sorry, 1 moment.
Oh, you have a major...
No, it's fine. Sorry.
Did you camera phone?
No. It's the
thingy.
the thingy unscrewed and I couldn't screw it back.
Can you start that sentence from the beginning? Do you remember when you stopped?
I forget which one.
The last one, maybe someone remembers.
On language. Ukrainian language.
Yeah, the whole thing's about Ukrainian. Well,
Даже Ukraine's language. Ну, там після...
Ukraine's language.
Там ще...
Yeah, so in the 1960s, are you on?
Yeah, now I'm done. Yeah.
In a 1967 interview, it was interesting that Shellis talked about Ukraine's language as being important, not the language of Ukraine, implying that it actually has official status. And he also said a visiting delegation that only a fool can imagine there is a possibility of Russians supplanting Ukraine. The head of Gosplan says, I believe everybody should speak Ukrainian, and on and on and on. But what is really interesting is the demands that were coming from society about this. So how do you gauge demands coming from society? Where are these made? Well, you know, there was no, you didn't have internet, you didn't have whatever, you know, YouTube. Where these things were expressed were in letters to newspapers. And the one newspaper that I always used to read was the Робітнича газета, which most of my colleagues didn't read, but it was actually very important to read it because it was run by people who were very good, very conscientious, and it was very pro-Ukrainian. And it was a predominantly working class audience, and it had millions of people reading it. So, on the pages of Робітнича газета, you have a Russian resident of Donbass chastising other Russians for failing to learn Ukrainian. You have people saying if you had the good fortune to live within a linguistic community, it's about time you learned the language of the land. They solicit a Russian writer living in Ukraine who says, well, look, you know, we need to do the same thing as in the 1970s, and that is have Ukrainianization and this kind of stuff. So it was very, very interesting to read these things coming with letters from Робітнича газета that talked about the need for more books and newspapers, all kinds of stuff. So the language that pointed, of course, to the slow erosion of the native language influence in the 1960s, especially to the 70s. This development was linked to the steady downgrading since 1933 of Ukrainian as a medium of public administration. Surveys showed that Ukrainians use the language much more frequently at home, but much less frequently at work. And language that clearly showed the impact of the workplace and the educational system on language according to age group. So if you look at all of Ukrainians in the USSR, 3/4 of children under the age of 9 were unilingual Ukrainian speakers in 1970. 3/4 only spoke Ukrainian. You go to the next age group, where it already participates in the labor form, and this changes. Labor market, and this changes. So the deterioration of these indices had, of course, very, very much to do with political defeats. It's not that because you were urban and you had education, that the modernization of the social structure meant that you would, of course, be speaking Russian, not be speaking Ukrainian. It had enormously much to do with the political defeat of the pro-Ukrainian forces and the growing prominence of Russian forces in Ukraine, especially with the Sovnarkhoz reform, which decentralized the economy, abolished ministries in Moscow, but sent all of these guys from the ministries into Ukraine. And that was the very big influx that you had. So these people were not coming like migrants, to have subordinate jobs. These people were being dropped immediately into positions of management and this sort of thing. That was the paradox of that reform, which on the one hand gave Ukraine a lot of economic rights, but these rights tended then to be, in a practical way, so many of the leading people over there in these regional entities came from Russia. Although it did have an impact, I don't know if you remember, but we talked about last time, I guess, how the urbanization of the center Ukraine and western Ukraine happened, and that had very much to do with this period and with Shelis, who wanted to see more urbanization and industrialization of this region. So when you look at Western literature of this period, there were two competing views. Well, actually, the dominant Western view, which was also supported by, surprisingly, by Soviet theory, the dominant modernization theorists, very influenced by structural functionalism, they argued that industrialization causes the social structure of the core region like Russia to diffuse into the periphery, Ukraine, leading to interactions that create commonality, be social structural fusion. Over time, wealth becomes more evenly distributed and cultural differences lose significance in this cauldron of modernization. These socioeconomic changes drive conversion in individual roles, as industrialization results in structural differentiation. Status is earned rather than ascribed. Social relations become more impersonal. As noted by two Soviet writers, the division of labor in this period, with this process, is based on professional, not national identity. The other model, which is of course much less optimistic, and this is the model that I use in the book, which was the terminology was developed by Hector, or at least he made it very popular, is the one called internal colonialism, where he said that increasing core periphery contact failed to result in social structural conversion. Instead, the spatially uneven wave of modernization results in advanced and less advanced group. The developed core exploits its advantages over the peripheral areas, stabilizing this unequal relationship through policies that maintains it. It results in a cultural division of labor, where high status positions are reserved for core members, while peripheral populations hold lower level positions. If social stratification is based on observable cultural differences, the disadvantaged group is going to protest. So this is a hypothesis about a different possibility of development. The question is, you have to find evidence for it. You can't just say it. So a key aspect of internal colonialism is precisely the absence of social structural convergence, meaning that significant social structural differences persist despite the group is integrated into the state. Social convergence would suggest that the internal colony gains access to the same resources of the dominant state. Because you're part of the dominant state, but this did not occur. In fact, the inequalities were entrenched and in some cases deepened. So one of the reasons for emphasizing and understanding internal colonialism is because when people talk about Ukraine as a colony, many people will say, well, but it's not a colony. Really, look, I mean, you have nice cities and, this is not, Rwanda, Burundi or something like that. While the colonial status is understood when it comes to language and culture, they find it difficult to understand its deeper structures. That in fact, internal colonialism is about the deeper structures. So regarding social structural convergence. Let's look at the working class and its weight in society. So what proportion of the population belongs to the working class? Especially in the USSR, it was a very good indicator of economic and industrial development since the service industry was basically non-existent. So these data are very, very telling about economic and industrial development. What you find is that if you look at the evolution of Ukraine's class structure and compare that with Russia's, you have it becomes very apparent that there are discriminatory economic policies. So let's look at a starting point, 1939. The social structure of Ukrainians in the Ukrainian SSR was pretty well as modernized as that of Russians within the USSR. There are 1 or 2% differences. But by 1970, the social structure inequalities have grown. For example, in 1939, the working class represented amongst Russians, right, was 8.9% larger than within the Ukrainian population. So the proportion of Russians that were working class was 8.9% greater than the proportion of the working class amongst Ukrainians. That gap increased to 16%. It almost doubled by 1970. And that's very telling about economic development. If you look at white-collar staff within the class structure of Russians, the difference between them and Ukrainians, again, you understand what I'm talking about, the proportion of white-collar within state. That was 5% difference in 1939. By 1970, the difference was over 10%. The least mobilized class, collective farmers, were heavily overrepresented among Ukrainians. Within the class structure of Ukrainians in 1970, 25% of the population were collective farmers. If you compare Ukrainians and Russians, the difference in 1939 had only been 4%, whereas the difference by 1970 is very, very broad. The changes in the class structure of Ukraine pointed to a crisis of social mobility of Ukrainians in their own republic. And here you have to distinguish between individual social mobility and structural social mobility, between real and perceived mobility. Ukrainians registered substantial increases within the working class from 66% in 1939 to 75% by 1970. Ukrainians are no longer underrepresented in the working class. Moreover, the working class of Ukraine occupied third place among the republics of the USSR in terms of national homogeneity. If you recall what the working class was like back in the 20s and before the revolution, the fact is that it was among the most homogeneously national in the 70s. What did not change was Ukrainian underrepresentation among white-collar staff in more elite groups. Between 1939 and 1970, Ukrainians had a significant underrepresentation in the white-collar staff. The Russians moved out of the working class to white-collar positions, and every second Russian in Ukraine was a white-collar worker. So the class pyramid and the position of the various nations within it had really remained the same. So in Hector's terms, Ukraine had a cultural division of labor in which high status positions were reserved for members of the core and the periphery was relegated to lower positions. The Soviet census data divides the population into three classes: collective farmers, служащие, and workers. So if you look about the predicament of the collective farmers in that period, we're talking about 1970. Ukraine has black earth. It has extremely high agricultural productivity. It contributes 25% of the USSR agricultural income. But in terms of the income of collective farmers in Ukraine, all sources, it is in the last place among 15 republics. Now, explain how it happens that the richest agricultural land has peasants working on that land, collective farmers, that are the poorest among 15 republics. Denied an internal passport until 1974, their geographical movement was controlled in a way that was very similar to South African apartheid. And Ukrainian rural youth were denied a higher education in their own language. Ukraine did not have control over its higher education institutions. And from 1954 on, Ukrainian was dropped as a compulsory entrance exam. Russian remained. Look at the consequences. If you look at 1926, the key indicator at that time would be literacy, because so much of the population were illiterate. Ukrainian had the second highest literacy rate of any nation in the Soviet Union. But by 1970, Ukraine's rural population ranked last among 15 republics. And we're talking about Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, some really poor places. In 1970, Ukraine's rural population ranked last among 15 republics in the proportion of young people with some higher education. That's the ages of 20 to 29. By the way, Kyrgyzstan was second, was number 2 in the Soviet Union as a proportion of people with higher education in rural areas. But if you look then at the next age group below, and that is 16 to 19, Ukrainians had the second highest proportion of young people completing successfully secondary education. So if you complete secondary education very successfully and you're number 2, how in God's name, when it comes to higher education, you're number 15? Well, I think you don't have to be Einstein to figure that out. They couldn't get into university. They could not pass the barrier into university. And the disappointments that they must have felt when they were unable to realize their ambitions was undoubtedly a source of social and national tensions. And at the same time, it meant that industry was getting young people that were quite angry about the fact that they came into the working class because they could not get into university. So let's talk about the working class. In the early years of the Soviet regime, the weakest link was the peasantry. But the famine, repression, the apartheid type status in society silenced their voices. The voice of the village was silenced. But they contributed the human resources of the working class. And in the post-war period, it was the working class that appeared as the Achilles heel of the regime. The mass protests that started the movement for independence, we tend to forget, began in 1989 with strikes in Donbass against their difficult position, well before anybody else was having demonstrations, and expressed sentiments in favor of independence, and of course were publicly supported by Ruch, only Ruch never developed a social program, much to its, not exactly a favorable spot in its history. Workers, and when I talk about these things, I'm talking about things that happened, because I studied whatever it is that you could study about what was happening in the working class. Workers challenged the monopoly of power of the Communist Party that it enjoyed until September 91. Workers called for workers' control, protested the privileges of the elite, supported demands for social and political reform, and especially in Western Ukraine, workers, Chervonograd and all of that, Khmara, I don't know if you remember this character, came out of that mining community, played an important role in the national movement. In the 1990s, of course, the workers faced uncertainty with a transition from a command to a market economy, and they were very worried. About large-scale unemployment. And this story we'll talk about maybe next time, but the story of the workers' movement in this period has yet to be told. By 1980, the majority of Ukrainians belonged to the working class, 56%. They were 3/4 of the workforce in the chemical, machine building, and metal workers. Women formed 50% of the working class because you had almost the total employment of women. And the gender dimension is one of these other things. The gender dimension of the social structure is one of these other things that Berling's researched. So de-Stalinization in 1956 brought a noticeable increase in industrial conflict in Ukraine, because it was possible to do. Protests against low wages and bad working conditions mounted. Workers, especially in the industrial center, displayed a lack of trust in the regime. In Kharkiv, Titov, the oblast secretary, criticized workers who rejected, quote, the one-man management principle and wanted to introduce workers' control. Donbass was the scene of large-scale rioting in 1962, large-scale rioting that produced a semi-insurrectional situation. Throughout the 1960s, many strikes occurred in Ukraine as the republic's working class took its first hesitant step towards self-assertion. In 1970s, there were even embryonic attempts to establish trade unions. In fact, Ukraine was a leading center of worker unrest in the USSR. This was not merely as a result of economic difficulties, nor the suppression of workers' rights, but there were some issues that were entirely specific to Ukraine, why Ukrainian workers were such a leader in this protest. One is that the Ukrainian working class was very heavily concentrated. 2/3 worked in factories, over 1,000 workers. The problem was that because of very low investment in these factories, there was low level of mechanization, and the level of productivity was below all union standards. And the poor mechanization also resulted in the heavy use of manual labor and very unsafe conditions. In Donbass, mining was starved for new investment. Workers' safety deteriorated and became a huge cause of unrest. Well, the problem was very simple, why this was the case, and that is because 1959 and 1970, half of the capital formed in Ukraine was reinvested outside the republic. I mean, I don't know how many times you have to get these figures to get angry at Russia. They take half your capital. Your peasantry that produces 1/4 of agriculture has the lowest income. You know, it's like time and time again, you're bashed over the head. I mean, to have half your total capital formed in your republic invested somewhere else is a very, very big number. The drain of capital impacted Ukraine in many ways. One was that the earned income of workers in Ukraine was were placed 9th out of 15 republics. And when you're 9th place in 15 republics, you're really competing with republics that are not very developed and don't have this rich industrial past of Ukraine. Anyway, I could go through all of these figures of consumption of consumer durables, infrastructure, hospitals, food consumption, etc., was well below the norm. The fact that there was food shortage was just outrageous, because as was written in Ukraine at that time, is that the reason why we have a shortage of sunflower is because 98% of sunflower production of an oblast that it specializes in, this Poltava, is exported with hard currency going to Moscow. So the working class of Ukraine presents a paradox very similar to the collective farmers. It was one of the best educated in the USSR. In Russia, 12% of workers had completed secondary education in 1970. In Ukraine, 18% of Ukrainian youth completed secondary education. That is quite an achievement. In Moscow itself, 55% of young people entering the labor force had completed secondary education. But in Ukraine as a whole, the figure was 63%. So you have almost everybody, figures speak for themselves, an exceptionally high rate of completing secondary education. The paradox was that while the proportion of young people with qualifications necessary for higher education, Ukraine was among the lowest in the Soviet Union in terms of entry into higher education. Basically in last place. So after the Stalinization, the reactivation of Ukraine's working class was in its infancy as society slowly emerged out of a state of immobility, atomization, and fear. Given the mechanisms of social control, self-assertion was yet an unrealized potential. But in the post-1956 period, it was clear that this self-assertion could flow along national lines. And you read about this time and time over again in Robotnicha Gazeta. On the cultural front, you had workers' letters from Donbass, Odessa, Kherson, complaining about shortages of Ukrainian language, literature, films, theaters, and other activities. What was interesting is that when Shelest was deposed in 1972, an absolute thorough chauvinistic pogrom took place in Robotnicha Gazeta, silencing everyone who had worked in this very popular newspaper. In Western Ukraine, virtually the entire membership of two clandestine nationalist groups, I'm not talking about Nato, and all of this, and these were other clandestine nationalist groups that were formed, were entirely comprised of workers. In Kiev, workers were arrested for leaflets opposing Russification. In Donbass, young miners in an open letter questioned party authorities about their policies regarding the development of the Ukrainian language. In 1964, in Darija, the working class district of Kiev, a flag was hoisted on May Day and flew, nobody noticed it, so it flew for quite a number of days before they noticed the flag and the slogan, "Long live a free Ukraine." This cultural division of labor, as I want to reiterate, where every second Russian in Ukraine worked as a white-collar worker, resulted in a situation, as Ivan Zuba writes in his Internationalism or Russification, a very good book to read, the national question again develops into the social one. The national barrier aggravates and exacerbates social division. Is one of the things I keep repeating is the social dimension of the national question that tends to be overwhelmingly ignored. So this is why when workers in Ukraine first began asserting their claims as a class, they inevitably raised national demands as well. So, what time is it? Stop?
15 хвилин. 20.
Oh, wow. Also done. So the intelligentsia, by the way, it's not like the intelligentsia now, right? The intelligentsia in the Soviet Union was anyone with a higher education who worked, who was employed, and who was involved, whose work involved mental labor and was an organizer of labor. So that included engineers and all of this kind of stuff. We tend to equate intelligentsia with intellectuals academics and the kind of people that hang around here. The intelligentsia is a much broader definition. There are millions of people involved in a situation where there is no private property, where the only way you can get ahead is going through these organizations. Entry into any position of importance in the Soviet Union required a university degree, no matter how you obtained it. So, and there was a very sharp difference between those people who were part of this big group called intelligentsia and who were the organizers of labor and all of that, and everybody else. So in the Soviet Union, as I mentioned, as we just mentioned, higher education was the key to occupational and social mobility. If you actually do a comparison of social mobility rates of working class kids in the United States and compare the social mobility rates in the Soviet Union, you had far greater chance of social mobility in the United States than the Soviet Union. The social mobility from worker to the intelligentsia in the Soviet Union was relatively limited. Had one of the worst records of any advanced capitalist country. This is really paradoxical when people think of the Soviet Union as some kind of worker state. It was anything but that. And if you look at party congresses, workers, were there as kind of, for decoration. So, and gaining entry was obviously a very competitive process. It was difficult to get in. Contacts helped. The fact that entrance exams were oral. Do you have oral entrance exams? We have written. Okay, so in the Soviet Union, there were oral exams. You can imagine the discretionary power that I have in terms of your oral answer. Or I could ask you a question which was actually asked of somebody who failed to get into history. What was the name of Alexander the Great's horse? I don't know. Too bad. Or I can ask you, when did the October Revolution happen? And you pass. So there was none of these kind of, university sitting exams, and all of this kind of stuff. In the discussion, I'll tell you my story about Kyrgyzstan because it's really quite hilarious how this played back against them. But I'll do that later. So higher education was the key to entry for good employment, etc. And increasingly it became hereditary. If Papa was the director of a factory and knew everybody at the Polytechnic and the Synok, or, invariably was the Synok comes to the entrance exams, he phones up the people at the Benicia. I got the tail end of it because I was heading an institution where I had to answer these calls. But actually I didn't answer the calls because for the duration of this period, I left Kiev just so that nobody would bother me. So the 1.1 million Ukrainians who belong to the intelligentsia, they form 54% of the total. So compared to 75% of the workers and 90% of collective farmers, being 54% is a significant underrepresentation. The intelligentsia was over 2 million. But from the perspective of Ukrainian history, this was an enormous force. I mean, you can imagine having an intelligentsia of 1.1 million as opposed to several hundred people in Kyiv in 1917. This was a critical group because they formed the bare majority and they were the most exposed to pressures of Russification, far more than any other group. I mean, frankly, they couldn't care less what language the collective farmers spoke. And the guys in Darnica можете speak по-українськи all you want, right? But at this level, it was very important that you become acculturated into Russian culture. There was a concerted campaign to elevate Russian culture and to make it synonymous with all that was modern and progressive. The message contained in book after book after book and articles was that is to influence that culture should influence personality development, personal development, and that Russia should play a huge role. And I have to read you this not leading quote. And this was very typical. The Russian language is unusually supple and brimming with bright colors. The Russian language is the greatest achievement of all human communication. It has gathered the finest elements of world culture and science. Without it, a cultural revolution and the formation of a new man is absolutely impossible. And it is for these reasons that Russians have a boundless sense of responsibility to develop and propagate their language. I mean, you know, the world's biggest achievement. But in fact, you had two independent systems of orientation going on. The intelligentsia, the elite, was confronted by a highly competitive social milieu because of the influx of Russians. And this engendered their national consciousness. Okay, so let me go back to say that the logic of this and of colonial powers that always masked their rapacity as a mission to civilize the world was that by changing an individual's cultural preferences, the psychological attitude of people towards whom you dominate will change as well. Simply put, if I get you to appreciate and love Russian culture, and you're just dying for Pushkin, you're not going to mind your Russian boss because you will have this commonality. In essence, the strategy of Russification is that an individual would become so steeped in Russian culture there would be no room for Ukrainian. So assimilation, and so assimilated would they be that national distinctiveness would not be a criterion in assessment of hierarchies. They wouldn't pay attention. Yet that didn't happen, and on the pages of the press and in the academic literature, you find time and time again references in the 1960s and early 70s to the fact that our intelligentsia has begun to display moods alien to our way of life. Nationalist manifestations among them are still far too dangerous to be underestimated. Well, in the realm of orientations regarding national identity, the intelligentsia are a little bit more complex than Russification agenda thought. Because, to make a long story short, because the intelligentsia makes greater use of its brains, the Russian content does not push out the Ukrainian one, it coexists with what was originally there. Learning another culture, it does not mean anorexia of the national. I can take myself. I mean, I probably have a number of identities, but at no point do they push it out. They just happily coexist. And cultural aesthetics. And what the other thing of what they found about the intelligentsia is that they, and especially this, it was interesting, there was a study of the scientific intelligentsia, and that is a very unusual, I think we talked about it before, that because the faculties of history and all of that were so politicized, they all taught the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the most interesting people were in the science faculty. And they found that among scientists, they were among the most to appreciate cultural aesthetics. And this was a group also that was most critical about national relationships. In short, you had two systems of orientation. One was I live in a competitive milieu and I have this competition with Russians. On the other hand, although I know Russian, it has not displaced my Ukrainian identity. It was very interesting that the most popular books amongst the scientific intelligentsia was Ukrainian history. what's his name, Radchenko's book about whatever, some sort of Cossacks, and Ivan Le's book about Khmelnytsky. I mean, they literally sold thousands and thousands and thousands of copies. So the sociologists in faraway Novosibirsk suggested to the authorities, much with that paid no attention, is that if you want to do something about national, smooth out national relations, it's not by accelerating Russification, it's about promoting social mobility. And unless you promote social mobility and get people opportunities and all that entails, you're going to have a national problem. So let's deal with the party now, and I think I'll probably finish soon. We have an interesting situation with the party that began the dismissal of Petroshelis in 1972 was quite significant because he was dismissed for national deviation. And it's been some time since somebody in the Communist Party was dismissed. And it was symptomatic of the greater sense of national assertiveness that permeated the party. And the reason why that was simply because of changes in the society. What happened during the Second World War, actually, is that there was, you remember we talked about the Second World War and how they made concessions, they talked about the Ukrainian front, about Khmelnytsky, and so the party thought, that the party guys for Ukraine said, great, let's use this as an opportunity. And since everybody else had left, they were the ones who remained. They actually used the opportunity of the war to significantly improve their position. So there were only 15,000 members of the Communist Party remaining under German occupation. I mean, that's not a lot for that kind of country. After the war, they had to build up the party, and they built up the party from those people who because the party there were entire rayons, the areas of Ukraine where there were no members of the Communist Party. So they built it up very, very quickly, and they built it up out of the people who knew local conditions, and i.e., they built up with Ukrainians, especially in oblasts of central West Ukraine, Poltava, Chernihiv. There was a huge push for Ukrainians. So you find that by 1949, 61% of the Communist Party are Ukrainians. Out of 119 members of the Central Committee, 60% are Ukrainian. I mean, in 1940, 40%. So among members and all that, they're still underrepresented, but they've become the majority. What had not changed is that the leadership of the Communist Party was Russian. The first secretary, Khrushchev, second secretary, Melnikov, were Russians. Of 13 full Politburo members, only 6 were Ukrainian. At the same time, as there was a doctoral dissertation, which I managed to see in Moscow, that said that 71% of leading cadre, people that work in the districts, right, 71% were Ukrainians. So this is quite a number. So what happened with Ukraine was very fortunate that Stalin died because it saved Communist Party of Ukraine cadre from a purge which was being prepared in connection with the Jewish doctors plot. Because too many Ukrainians had entered into the party and were unreliable, so you had to clear them out. So while in Moscow there was a struggle for power as a coup d'etat by Khrushchev, who's supported by other members of the Politburo and Marshal Zhukov, they removed Beria from power and execution. There's uncertainty over there. What is happening in Ukraine is a quick consolidation at exactly the same period. So the plenum that is called in 1953 of the Central Committee they dismissed Melnikov, who was so for the first time in the history of the Communist Party, the head of the Communist Party of Ukraine is Ukrainian. And that is 1953, after Melnikov is dismissed for his failures in nationalities policy. You have Kirichenko as the first secretary in all of that. The whole point was that the entire Politburo was Ukrainian. This was unheard of. And of that Politburo that was Ukrainian, what is interesting, 7 were born in central western Ukraine and northeastern Oblast, that is the very Ukrainian Oblast. And this is the first time that not everyone was from Donbass, as it was in the past. And I think that this geographic shift in representation was very important. When all is said and done, don't forget that Kravchuk was from Volhynia. And that played a role. So let's look at the broad contours of development which occurred. The Ukrainians achieved top positions in the party, and this happened because of changes in the social structure. And also because Khrushchev really needed Ukrainian support in his bid for leadership. So in Khrushchev's mind, it was, and this was announced, articulated in the celebrations of the 300th anniversary of Pereyaslav Treaty. This was a big to-do about the partnership between Ukrainians and Russians. Ukrainians were the 2 great Slavic people of the Soviet Union, and they were going to be number 2 in terms of the imperial project. Well, Ukrainians were, of course, happy and grateful for this, but did not mean that they did not want to continue to pursue autonomy for Ukraine, which in fact they did. Because in the post-war period, Ukraine was the victim of the scissors of colonialism. In every single sector of industry, Ukraine's share of all union production declined, whereas Russia's share increased. For example, in 1957, the Central Committee of the Communist Party demanded in a resolution that Ukrainian Gosplan be given full control over the economy in its territory. There was an economic sovereignty declared 25 years later. This was the strongest statement of Republican economic autonomism made by the CPU. Observers noted, very interestingly, that Ukrainian national feeling was strongest among Ukrainian planners and managers because they have intimate knowledge. They know the details of economic discrimination against their republic. The new Ukrainian political elite was comprised of individuals who were trained for leadership and wanted to lead, and they were incredibly frustrated politically and economically by the hyper-centralized system which refused to recognize them as a force and share power with them. For example, Shellis could not sanction the construction of a pedestrian underpass in Kyiv without first obtaining permission from Moscow. If you're the head of the Communist Party of Ukraine and you have to crawl to some guy in Moscow for this permission, you obviously don't feel good about it. Under Shellis, for example, an attempt was made to re-Ukrainianize the political apparatus by opposing the influx of non-Ukrainian cadre into the republic. And the new elite sought its own ideology to justify its claims and found sources of legitimacy in its own unique national heritage. And a fair amount was done about that. In the chapter that you read, you will find reference to what is called the Dadenkov reforms to Ukrainianize higher education, to give priority to admission to those who have a full command of the Ukrainian language or are prepared to learn it, and the opportunity to sit candidatsky examines in all disciplines should be in Ukrainian. That such measures were needed was very obvious from the information supplied by Dadenkov. In the 50 educational institutes of the Republic under his ministry, Ukrainians formed only 55% of students. is a significant underrepresentation, and 49% of teaching staff. That figure, 55 and 49, is roughly what it had been in 1926, just as Ukrainization was taking off in Ukraine. Out of the 72,000 students attending 8 universities in the Republic, 61% were Ukrainian, only 56% of the staff was Ukrainian, and only 30% of lectures were delivered in Ukrainian. I suppose you couldn't teach Ukrainian language and literature without using Ukrainian. Of course, Dadenkov reform was squashed by a directive from Moscow, but the failure of the attempt to reform in 1965 was not the end of the Republic's attempt to try to change the situation. So, for example, things such as the introduction of Ukrainian as a language of university examination and all subject was raised after that date, and as I understand, that happened. The major impediment in the efforts of the Republic's leadership to bring about a change in higher education was only a small proportion of the vuze in the country were under direct control of Ukraine. So in the latter half of the 1960s, what they did was to organize a rector's council where the representative of every vuz would be in Ukraine, irrespective of whether they're under Republican jurisdiction or all union jurisdiction. And this was quite a bold measure to try to horizontally organize a platform for the leadership in the party. And of course, in 1971, backed by Shellis, Dadenkov says, all institutions of higher education on the territory of the Republic should be transferred to authority to Ukraine, under Ukrainian authority. Well, Shellis was removed from office in 72, and Dadenkov also was removed. Consider Khrushchev's reform in 1958-59. That was quite a reform that had colossal consequences in the republics, especially in places like Central Asia, and also here. The reform was that you have two language systems. You have the Russian language system and the national language system. The Russian language system is growing, but they used to teach the national language in the Russian language system. The reform in 1959, the Khrushchev reform, said no. It's not compulsory, it's optional. It's up to the parents to decide whether or not you're going to do that. Well, there was a huge furor about this in everywhere, in Ukraine, and this kind of stuff. The law was passed, but the Ukrainians did not implement it. And Ukrainian continued to be a compulsory subject without making a very big deal out of it, which is one of the reasons why I, as a Ukrainian speaker, in the 1970s and 1990s, could go to Donbass and speak Ukrainian, and guys would understand me. I urge you to go to Kuzbas and speak Ukrainian and see how many people will understand you. They won't. And this is the result of the fact that they were very lax in implementing. That's all. There was a huge battle around Ukrainian book distribution, because distribution of book was an all-union thing controlled from Moscow by Soyuz Pechat. And if somebody decided not to distribute Ukrainian newspapers, there's nothing you can do short of go there and protest and all of this kind of stuff. But as part of the campaign to prove that Ukrainian was adequate for conveying the most complicated contemporary scientific concepts, 2 path-breaking works on cybernetics were published in the Ukrainian language. These books did not appear in Russian, and people in Moscow were outraged that this was allowed to happen in Ukraine. How dare they publish things that we haven't published and haven't even thought about? And so I'm referring to Івахненко's кібернетичні системи комбіноване керування, and the most amazing book, which is the 2-volume Encyclopedia Kybernetiki. I mean, this is way before anybody even thought about this kind of stuff. And that was published. in Ukraine. And that was really quite an achievement. Shell's removal was engineered by the Russian leadership and occurred at a time when Moscow was introducing centralist initiatives. What is interesting about his removal is that they wanted him to be formally removed by convoking all of the oblast first secretaries and to have them 25, to have them vote their hands, and they were told, vote their hands for his removal. Only 3 said yes. 22 said no. Well, needless to say, there was a purge of the party afterwards. And the more compliant Stumbitsky came there. With the fall of Shell's autonomism as a movement within CPU suffered a major blow, but the conditions that gave rise to it in the first place did not change. Its re-emergence within the CPU would remain part of the historical record, and part of the historical agenda. So in Ukraine, there emerged a spontaneous, multiform, widespread, self-originating movement of national defense. And we're talking about the rise of dissent. They weren't called dissent at that time. This movement articulated its own democratic vision of society, which included broad cultural, economic, and political rights for the republics, and very many people participated. When the regime attempted to intimidate and silence these people, the movement offered resistance, and a new phenomenon emerged called dissent and dissidence. With Brezhnev, the Soviet Union entered a period of stagnation characterized by economic decline, greater discontent, repeated clampdowns on society. After Shell's, the parts of the Ukrainian party understood that trying to reform within the USSR is a lost cause. And I think that's why you have communists and directors of large enterprises who formed the majority of parliament voting for independence of Ukraine. But as a last gasp in fighting Ukrainian self-assertion, in early 1970, Brezhnev launched a massive Russification campaign in Ukraine. And we look at what happened. The number of Ukrainian language journals dropped from 46% in 1969 to 19% by 1980, after that campaign, which began shortly after Shell's fall. The number of Ukrainian books as a proportion of total output was 60% in 1958. It was 24% by 1980. There were 50 studio theaters in Ukraine. By 1980, only 2 were in the Ukrainian language, 15. There were 7 theaters for youth, only 1 was Ukrainian. 40 all-union ministries under this arrangement took control of 90% of enterprises in Ukraine. It's really run from Moscow. And of course, you had economic growth in this period that hovered at 1% or so and stopped, and the Soviet Union collapsed, and its happy collapse is something we'll discuss next time.
Ну, після лекції така, не знаю, в мене виникла думка, що власне там все життя і в школі там всюди лунали ідеї, це там і власне на початку навчання в Могилянці, що комуністи зробили Україну незалежною. І ось коли ви сказали про те, що власне там, умовно, партія певною мірою вона поновилася туди, там зайшли українці. Ось я хотіла вас спитати, наскільки, власне, це відіграло роль? Чи все-таки бажання незалежності, воно було таким, бажанням керувати самостійно, бажанням бути самостійною вершиною?
Ні, ну я є еліта національна, я хочу керувати вершиною. Це весь смисл антиколоніальної боротьби. Французький метод шину. Ми є хазяїни в своїй хаті. Це є нормальний мотор, який пхає людей до боротьби за незалежність. Бо це також відкриває можливості до соціальної мобільності. Ну, ви знаєте, як ти зміниш вступ до іспитів, так, то відкривається велика дорога для дітей, колгоспників і робітників, щоб попали в вуз. І в системі це було неможливо. Я попадав в найкращі університети, а мій батько був робітником. В Радянському Союзі це було б навіть не можна подумати собі це. Бо я не мав ніякого блата, ніяких знайомих і так далі. Я був би, я не знаю, якимось там слюсарем в Дніпрі. То я думаю, що це очевидно, що вони хотіли цього, так? А для них була загроза, що це не тільки вони хотіли, але суспільство хотіло. Ну, ви знаєте, рух не міг організувати мільйони людей, які виходили. Все каже, рух. Більшість людей виходили, навіть не знали, що рух є, просто виходили. І це був великий рух в суспільстві. І це чому я завжди наголошую, що, знаєте, слухайте, що відбувається. Ви знаєте, я написав статтю про синьо-жовтий прапор. Де він першим був повішений? Хто його повісив? Що воно означало для людей? Так? І це дуже цікаво. Знаєте, оці козацькі слави. Я там був один із почетних організаторів цього всього на Запоріжжя. Як це? Там були десятки тисяч людей, які приїхали на це свято. То ця партія віддзеркалювала суспільство. Проблема, що вона хотіла залишитися при владі. Тільки як я можу залишитися при владі в демократичних умовах? І що робити із директорами? Знаєте, всі думали, що ось буде Україна, радянська Україна, і ми будемо панувати. Ну, тільки що ми будемо це робити. І директори, які зрозуміли, що вони тепер частину України і так далі, ми будемо тиснути Київ, щоб давали нам субсидії для шахтарів і так далі. Але економія гепнула. І тепер вони не мали жодного поняття про як будувати ринкову економіку. І про це будемо говорити наступний раз. І ніхто не мав ідеї, як провадити промислову політику, економічний ріст. І ці всі радники заходів, вони були фатальні. Вони думали, що хай ці всі підприємства приватизують, де всякі заводи там віддавали. Знаєте, це купонна приватизація, якийсь купон і так далі. Ніхто не думав про як перетворити це в щось таке друге. І вони, багато з них успішно пристосувалися до нових умов. І це, зокрема, комсомольці, які приватизували, хапали все і були перший прошарок буржуазії. Це дуже було відомо. Це всі кооперативи і так далі. Це перший комсомол почав це все робити. І також батьки. Так що це одне другому не мішає. І я думаю, вони були дуже задоволені з того, що що ми тепер як ви владні, тільки що робити з владою. Ну, от цей путч їх дуже налякав. Бо вони думали, що якось це все буде в СНГ і так далі, і так далі. І так. Якось ми будемо жити в, знаєте, як ми, це буде як Європейський Союз, ми є незалежні держави і так далі. Це просто фікція. Це ніколи не було бо цього не прийшло. І вони не мали карту розвитку, бо ніхто не мав. Бо все ж таки радянський, ніхто не думав, що Радянський Союз розпадеться без одної людської жертви. Бо всі хотіли його розвалу. Включаючи з тією інтелігенцією, яка отримувала привілеї, бо вони мали посади, але ці посади залежали від якогось начальника. І ринок дає великі можливості, де я можу стати самостійним. Я можу збагатитися і долю показувати всім. Це велика перевага. Велика перевага ринка, що вона тебе робить самостійним агентом. Ти не залежиш від якоїсь влади. Я не думаю, що можна казати, знаєте, комуністи. Ну, факт є, що вони були в парламенті і голосували. Ну, якби не проголосували, їх засипали в камінь. Бо, знаєте, так.
У мене скоріше питання. Мене зацікавило, коли ви говорили про освіту, про вищу освіту і про те, що проект secondary education – це як професійно...
Ні, це повна середня освіта.
Так, повна середня освіта. Ви казали, що тут у нас в Україні була одна з найбільших відсотків успішно завершеної середньої освіти. Повний, але там дуже значно нижчий рівень вищої освіти. І про те, що там були екзамени оці і мало впускали студентів в університети. Але от у мене питання, а чому так і в чому була проблема? Що просто не вистачало місць в університетах, чи не хотіли конкретно українців так багато брати, чи в чому?
Ні, по-перше, не брали українців, бо це є університети, які формують планівну групу, і вони були зрусифіковані. І я, як українець, який кінчав українську школу і був в українському середовищі, я був менше конкурентний, ніж той, який сидів тут в Києві. Папа давав всякі контакти і так далі, і так далі. І факт є, що мережа вищої освіти в Україні була маленька. Там тільки було 8 університетів. Багато більше було цих профільних інститутів. 8 університетів на країну, яка тоді мала 50 мільйонів, це і ніщо. Бо їм не треба було університети мати. Це не хочуть університети, там ще почув думати і так далі. Ну, це не було аж так розвинуто. Це інститути, але там також був процес русифікації. І в процесі русифікації українці завжди були не мати перевагу. І для росіян вони закінчували російські школи, здавали іспити обов'язково в російській мові, колись це треба було здавати також іспит української мови. Це була просто соціальна дискримінація. Я думаю, це так.
І далі теж частково до цього. Як працювала так? Загалом це відносно зрозуміло, але доволі цікаво мені те, що про те, що говорили, що в Радянському Союзі вища освіта – це от пропуск в якусь більш-менш гарне життя відносно, і що це було потрібно для того, щоб стати частиною інтелігенції, і ніяк інакшим методом не можна було добитися якогось успіху, але з іншої сторони, декларувалась більше як якась така, ну, от, як ви кажете, це робітнича держава, що от всі
Це в
робітники.
Англії була робітнича держава, а не всі на світі.
А як це поєднувалося? Чи цьому
Ну як поєднувалося? Ви знаєте, коли ідеологія не совпадає із соціальною структурою, дві речі стають. Перше, ніхто не вірить в цю дурну ідеологію, бо ви можете мені говорити, скільки хочете, що я права робочих і так далі, а я робочий і дуже добре знаю. Чому так швидко ця вся ідеологія розсипалася? Капіталістична ідеологія, вона відповідає соціальній структурі. Комуністична ідеологія не відповідає соціальній структурі. І вона є unsustainable. І це є частина цієї соціальної формації, де капіталісти, ідеологія кажуть підприємництво, individual initiative, ринок і так далі. І воно так і є. Так? Ну, там ніхто не каже, що це буде рівноправно. Є, знаєте, ця ідеологія під великим впливом соціал-демократичних норм і так далі. Але ідеологія і дискурс про твоє суспільство дуже відображає соціальну структуру. А в Радянському Союзі не було. Чому було вищого освіту? Бо ці посади всі, я не говорю про номенклатуру, це були посади, які треба було ЦК. Всі посади вимагали вищого освіту, директор цього і так далі, і так далі. Вимагали вищого освіту як кваліфікацію. Ну, і все ж таки, і тоді треба було дістати вищу освіту. І це було дуже тяжко, як ти не був. Ну, це було дуже тяжко для українців із соціальних причин, і ми бачимо результат.
Так, не знаю, які конкретно у нас запитання, але я точно пам'ятаю, і це, я думаю, важливо в нашому контексті, що колишні члени комсомолу, вони ставали не просто підприємцями, а доволі інноваційними підприємцями, маючи зв'язки, так, і навчаючись принаймні чогось. Електроніка, там, такі штуки, які вимагають якихось знань.
Ну, я би не сказав, бо комсомольці, по-перше, були такі привілейні групи, вони не дуже серйозно вчилися. І як там, вони купи-продай і так далі продавати, це все дуже успішно брали державні assets, активи, державні активи і збагатіли з того всього. Вони були неуспішні в другій фазі економічної реформи, коли треба було щось таке робити. І все це, яке має до діла із технологією сьогодні, IT і так далі, це є завдяки того, що Український університет, зокрема політехнічні інститути, не пасли зад і значить, були дуже успішні на продовження математичних знань і так далі. Що комсомольці були гульки, як, зокрема, це верхівка, привільовані і не дуже працювати. Ті, які робили щось, ну Пінчук, ну він не був, він може був комсомольцем, але він був фізик. Він знав процес, йому вдалося захопити це велике підприємство і збагатити він його за скільки? Як його? Азовсталь, він купив це за скільки? Я не знаю, за якусь смішну суму, як $14 мільйонів, або щось таке. Але це просто фантастика.
Там, бачу, ще з підприємствами вони купували ці різні санаторії, такі місця відпочинку при підприємствах.
Ну так, це збагачення, ну це як Дональд Трамп, між іншим.
Так, можливо, хтось зі мною ще проходив як соціологія підприємництва або економічна соціологія з Вінницьким. І він розвине мою думку. Можливо, Богдана, я думаю.
Ну, це дуже цікаво, щоб знати. Це емпіричне питання. Ну, я пам'ятаю ті часи і комсомольців. І це були люди, які знали про цю всю приватизацію, хапали активи, висилали це все на брухт і заробляли великі гроші і так далі, і так далі. Відкривали магазини, санаторії і так, і так. Але вони не знали дуже багато про підприємництво і не були великими двигателями рушійна сила в економічному розвитку, бо вони не мали той бекграунд. Це дуже швидко прийшли другі люди, які мали. І факт є, що Україна була катастрофічно неуспішна перші роки, коли ці всі товариші гуляли. ВВП в Україні впав за 50%. Україна є найбідніша країна Європи. Оце є досягнення. Про це будемо говорити. Відсутність реформ і так далі. Це складає. Ну, бо я думаю, ви про це все знаєте. Вам все одно не мале.
Мені здається, що якщо говорити в контексті змін до цього соціального, економічного стану, то насправді ось той фактор, що українці не мали доступу до вищої освіти, він вилився в те, що, наприклад, мій батько, він виріс з чіткою пропагандою від своєї матері, що ти маєш отримати вищу освіту, лише вищу освіту. І я все життя думала, що це було спровоковано великою бідністю, але зараз, я розумію,
абсолютно,
що це...
Слухайте, це є social aspiration.
Так.
В Киргизстані не пускали людей в вищу освіту. Була незалежність, всі рухнули масово до вузів. Enrollment, запис, як по enrollment?
Вступ,
Та не вступ, enrollment це є
набір
студентів в рісі. Маленька країна, яка має 6 мільйонів людей, має 63 університети. І всі кажуть, ну, боже мій, це є nothing, це є social aspiration. І я це дуже добре розумію. Якраз, що тебе мати каже, слухай, ти не міг попасти, ніхто з нашої родини не був в університеті. Ти будеш перший, який закінчив університет. Ти не хочеш йти? I don't care. Будеш йти, тебе буду бити. І всі йшли, так? І це то саме тут стало. Ну, всякі пройдисвіди відкривали, чорт його знає, як Поплавський, Боже. Всякі університети, і так далі. Це був великий поштовх. То, що воно не мало ніякого відношення до економіки, це всім відомо. Я колись, скільки на рік, я буду цитувати киргизьку статистику, бо я її свіжо знаю. Ну, і тільки думайте, тільки треба додати цифри, а це саме становище. В Киргизстані не треба мати 4500 випускників юристів кожного року. В країні йде no rule of law.
В Україні політологів звідти.
No rule of law, значить. Не треба 15 тисяч випускників економіки, яка не є economics, а є такий бізнес, коли я можу порахувати на пальці двох рук, скільки в Киргизстані є середніх бізнесів. Не треба цього всього. І the return on investment є дуже цікавий, бо є Це я йду в освіту, я інвестую. Так? Це по-англійськи називається Return on Educational Investment. Є дуже цікава статистичне дослідження, яке робиться кожний рік, кожні 2 роки в Киргизстані, Household Surveys. Як я є в Америці, і я маю вищу освіту, моя заробітна платня після якогось там періоду буде на 15-20% вища, ніж той, який не має освіти. В Киргизстані різниця між head of household, голова сім'ї, який має вищу освіту, і той не має вищу освіту, є 0,5. Makes no difference. А що цікаво, як я є голова сім'ї, я маю неповну професійну освіту, значить я знаю як сантехніку і так далі, я є на 3% вище, ніж той, який має вищу освіту. Так що the return on investment в education є просто не той. І тепер є велика спроба пхати людей в технічних науках, а тут проблема є математичне знання в середній школі. Тут Україна має перевагу, бо якимсь чудом, коли порівняємо, коли беремо PISA scores, Hey, Tamara, I'm in a class, I'll call you back, okay? PISA scores. Ізраїль і Україна. Ви знаєте, що є PISA scores? OECD. Ізраїль і Україна мають більш-менш ті самі показники, indicators of success. Є маленька різниця. Ізраїль на душу, на кожного студента витрачає $10,000, а в Україні менше 2,000. Як це пояснити? Тільки ентузіазмом і учителів. Ті вчителі, яких всіх іздіваються. Ці всі, знаєте, старші жінки, які... Ну, це колосальний успіх. Уявіть собі, якби було ще більше грошей. І це чому Україна є такий лідер, як в війні, ці технології і так далі, завдяки того, що в середньому світі ще читають, знають математику і йдуть до політехніки. Ну, воно помінялося. Але коли бачиш оце, такий, я дуже цікаво бачити two sets of data. І так далі. Як можна це пояснити? Це чому емпіричне дослідження є важливо, бо воно з нього виходить питання, яких треба ставити. Як ти не маєш емпіричних дані, ти не знаєш, які питання ставити.
Хочу далі доповнити якраз по темі за освіту. Перше, як ви проводили приклад в Киргизстані, здається, щодо того, скільки там людей на економіку вступало і випускалося кожен рік. У нас в Україні в нульових, здається, така динаміка була найбільше з юристами. Дуже багато хто йшов вчитися на юридичні факультети, в результаті випускалися, і відсотки 90 тих, хто вчилися на юриста, потім юристом не працювали. Стільки юристів попросту країні не треба. Також
в Киргизстані ми зробили дослідження, і більшість з юристів працювали в магазинах.
У нас, мабуть, схожа ситуація була. Те, що згадали Поплавського... Те, що згадали Поплавського, я думаю, там навіть така ситуація, що вони ходили до всіх в школи. Я не знаю, чи це тільки в мене так було. Я з Полтавської області взагалі, тобто до Києва мені не так близько. До мене там рази 2 чи 3 там, за останні класи школи приходили до університету Поплавського і ритуал вступав до них. Тобто така ще ситуація.
Це його фізіологію побачиш. Щось таке.
Але якщо серйозно, я хотів сказати, що з'явилася не тільки проблема, що в нас тепер всі в Україні з вищою освітою ходять, а є проблема в тому, що сама цінність через це вищої освіти тепер по суті відсутня. Багато де вища освіта в багато яких сферах тобі не дає переваги при працевлаштуванні, і диплом близько не вартує того, чого б він міг довартувати. Як ви наводили приклад, здається, знову ж з Киргизстаном, те, що різниця в інкам, тобто там в заробітній платі в США між людиною з вищою освітою і людиною без там велика, я не пам'ятаю, який відсоток сказали в Киргизстані, 0,03. Тобто в нас ситуація, якщо я не помиляюсь, теж схожа. І
вона є схожа, і я думаю, що тут є велика проблема, що немає реформи вищої освіти.
Так, зараз намагаються щось перейти на грантову систему освіти.
Та це все ідіотизм, Господи Боже мій. Це проблема є з вищої освіти, немає нічого до діла з цим. Грантові системи. По-перше, вони є супер... Давайте, я не буду про
Вони
це
ще
говорити.
грантові системи зробили не так, як це працює в західних країнах, а вони
визнаю.
всім студентам, які вступили на контракт, але там мають трошки вище, ніж 140 балів за загальний іспит, компенсують вартість, половину вартості навчання.
Перше, треба сказати, який... Anyway, вся структура є... Це не є питання, як фінансувати університети. По-перше, університети не мають ніякої автономії. Я просто шокований, коли я тут говорив з людьми про Public Policy Program, що є вступні іспити до Public Policy Program. Де в світі це все? Який формує експертна комісія, яка складається з дураків. І вони пишуть вступний іспит. І на кінець програми, не то, що вони закінчили тут і їм дається оцінки, є ще випускні іспити. Точно із тих людей, які не мають зеленого поняття what is public policy, бо вони в своєму житті не знали. Ну що це за освіта? Ну це просто ідіотизм. Перше, що треба зробити, це мати абсолютну автономію в університетах. Канада, Англія, всі університети є public universities. Вони є автономні. Ну, це не значить, що вони можуть робити, що вони роблять. And they get formula funding. Як ти маєш медичний факультет, ти дістаєш більше. Дістати дозвіл, і щоб відкривати, у нас немає приватних університетів. Ну, може є, але це для тих людей, які такі тупі, що вони не можуть поступити в нормальних університетах. Оксфорд, Кембридж і все це є public universities. Це дуже цікаво, що ось 10 найкращих університетів у світі, десь може 4 є в Англії, де немає приватних університетів. Німеччина і так далі. Як вони, вони мають автономію, self-governing. Є, очевидно, правила, ти не можеш таке робити. Але ти можеш бути, як то сказати, ти можеш бути original, ти можеш брати ініціативи, ти можеш мати нове і так далі, і так далі. І як держава, вона також має картину в своєму мозку, які є what are the labor market needs. Так, наприклад, провінція Альберти є, це провінція, яка є досить багата, десь має 3-4 мільйони. Вони сказали, на ту провінцію one school of architecture is enough. Нам не треба two schools of architecture, нам не треба 80 архітекторів, бо ми стільки не будуємо. So they control it this way. Ну, як ти хочеш приватну школу архітектури, будь ласка, ніхто там не піде, бо це є підтримано. То без цієї автономії не можна розрізнити. Тут є повно приватних університетів, чорт його знає, що там відбувається, бо це все так блатно. Я не знаю, де це почати, але я би почав від абсолютно автономії, де є наглядові ради, які керують університетом. І ректор відповідає наглядовій раді, а голова наглядової ради буде говорити з урядом. І це є початок. І тоді можна зрозуміти, як структурувати. Тепер треба також зрозуміти, що є цілий ряд установ вищої освіти, які не є присутні тут. Наприклад, не всі йдуть до університету. В Німеччині тільки малий відсоток людей йдуть до університету, також в Канаді. Вони отримують вищу освіту through community colleges, які є дуже серйозні community colleges, які є розповсюджені по малих містах, де ти можеш бакалаврат перші 2 роки, а тоді вступити в університет, або тобі дають applied прикладні предмети. В Німеччині є ціла система вузів, які називаються Hochfachschulen, Universities of Applied Sciences. І там юристи не будуть пастися. This is applied sciences. Ну тут просто цього немає. Universities of Applied Sciences. Друге, що немає тут, це є школи професійного непперервного навчання. Які дають людям, які є в професіях, можливість. Це є сектор, який є найбільш розвивається найбільш швидко в Європі і в інших країнах. Microcredits, microqualifications. Щоб я знав щось таке нове в Computer Sciences, мені не треба сидіти 4 роки і слухати, чорт його знає що, я можу піти і get a microcredit. Ну тут університети того не роблять. Я пам'ятаю, це є велика проблема. В нашому університеті, де ми є, ми маємо School of Professional and Continuing Education, який має 60 програм. 60 програм. Десь 23 центри. І за останні там, не знаю, 10 років ми мали 350 тисяч учасників. З такими програмами, як Small Business Management Using Least Cost Technologies. Значить, управління малого бізнесу із доступними технологіями. І так далі, і так далі. Цього тут немає. І я колись був в Бангладеші, був і виступав перед конференцією ректорів університету. Ну, це коло мене це сидів представник бізнесу, який був дуже злий на ці університети, що вони випускали інженерів. Поки вони випустять інженерів, то вже, знаєте, інженерська реальність в інженерії вже продвинута на 4-5 років. Їм треба робити якісь швидкі курси, щоб вони підтягнули. І вони кажуть, чому це є обов'язок університету, чому це є обов'язок підприємців, щоб учити, давати програми, які є сучасні і підходять. Ми не є вуз, ви не робите свою справу. І це, чому вони дуже хотіли, щоб я розказав про School of Professional Continuing Education. Ну, вони всі задерли носа і сказали, we generate knowledge. Well, that's cool. Я кажу, well, then I studied Oxford. Oxford does pretty well generating knowledge. And it has a school of professional and continuing education with 12,000 people. So if you want to know how to kruto робити roses, you'll have somebody from the botanical gardens giving you these courses. Oh, by the way, Harvard has that as well. In fact, every university has a massive school of professional and continuing education, який є дуже прибутковий. І так вони платять, щоб були факультети філософії. Okay, guys. Добрий пас. Христос все ж таки воскресне.
У мене коротке питання. Ви казали на лекції, на першій половині, що щось ще про Киргизстан розкажете. Ви сказали,
окей,
розказали те, що
окей,
хотіли, чи ще ні?
Окей.
Супер.
Там було, знаєте, там була така дискримінація проти воляки. Ну, я думаю, я вам це казав, що навіть назвали столицю Фрунзе, коли мав букви Ф. І просто не допускали. А був один із політехнік, один рідкий, який там дуже хотів продвинути студентів. І він готував по своїх селах, аїлах студентів, щоб вони пройшли іспити. І він сидить в цій комісії і каже, ну як я буду знати, хто ви є? Ви всі налез брити голову. І як будете підходити, я знаю, що це ви не можете запитати. І так, identifying malice, 30 людей поступило в політехніку. You can make a good film out of that. Отак прийшло судити. Окей. Щасливого вам.
Дуже дякую.
Дякую.